Hello and welcome to episode 52 of On Liberty, coming to you live from the Center for Independent Studies in Sydney, Australia. I'm your host, Salvatore Babonis, and joining us today live from London is David Martin Jones, visiting professor of war studies at King's College. We'll be asking David if postmodern politics have launched us on a ship of fools. David Martin Jones, how are you?
I'm very well, and it's good to talk to you, Salvatore.
Well, good morning, very well, and very awake, I see. Look, who are the history's fools of your latest book's title?
History's Fools is about the ideology that history ended. So it's basically those who bought into a teleology at the end of the 1980s that we were en route to a liberal, democratic, or progressive end of history. And the argument in the book is that this illusion led to a chain of consequences with which we are still dealing with the fallout from.
Now, the book, of course, is History's Fools, The Pursuit of Idealism and the Revenge of Politics. That's out now from Hearst. Revenge of politics? What's going on?
Well, the ideology behind the progressive end of history assumed that globalization, economic development, the fall of the Soviet Union would lead to all states following what Thomas Friedman at the end of the 20th century called a golden straitjacket, which would constrain all economies to follow a certain progressive route. The fallout politically is that it didn't happen, that the long war on terror, the financial crisis indicated the hubris behind this view, and it's that hubris we're now dealing with the rise of what one of the chapters calls the revisionist states, namely the People's Republic of China and Russia.
I'm going to Americanize that. You can make fun of me, but I did pick up on the liberal hubris of the progressive professional class being really at the heart of your argument. Is that, I mean, who are the hubristic ones here? Name some names for us.
Well, basically the Democrat Party.
United States? Is this a transnational movement, or is this just a U.S. Democrats problem?
Well, no, it's a transnational movement, but no, I mean its origins are obviously with Francis Fukuyama's initial, essay in the national interest, the end of history, which in that essay ended with a question. The book that came out in 1992 had a full stop at the end of it. But Fukuyama himself indicated some reservations about how history would end, although the general direction, the teleology, was towards this liberal, democratic, providential arrangement that would arise over time. But later writers, notably Thomas Friedman and others, and then really, whether it was Blair in the UK, Clinton in America, and then Bush, and in the UK, after Blair, it was Cameron. In Germany, it was Schroeder. All these politicians took this line that history was progressing in a way that was shaped by a Western liberal understanding. And although there might be blips along the road, this was the direction of history, and it was kind of unstoppable. And a number of writers, commentators at the time, all bought into this, what I see as a delusion.
I mean, you can't blame the U.S. Democrats for George Bush and David Cameron.
No, you can't.
So is this really one side of politics, or is this really an issue of an entire class of people who share a viewpoint about the world.
Yeah, I think this is that's the way I mean, the argument is that if there wasn't certain economic preconditions, namely the collapse of the Soviet Union, the globalization of markets, etc., then the ideology itself wouldn't have had a purchase, but its purchase was across it was across the media, it was across academe, and it was across the political class of the West. So whether it starts with a sort of a social democrat edge, with a democratic, reformative purpose, progressive, but it's sucked up by liberal conservatives. The center right also buys into the thinking. So it's a normative understanding that grips, I suppose, what you could call the political elites in the West, with ultimately devastating consequences.
Right. Now, I'm actually going to, hopefully, if we have time, take you up later on the Fukuyama issue, because personally, I'm more Fukuyama than Fukuyama himself. But let me establish your own position here first. Yeah. So if these are foolish people pursuing foolish policies, what's the reality that they're missing? What are they being so foolish about?
Well, the foolishness is that history has a direction and a purpose. It doesn't. As a skeptical philosopher that I used to, be involved with back in the last century, those who speak the language of history's development are speaking the language of a ventriloquist's dummy. So the assumption that history is moving in a direction that gripped an elite worldview is always going to have illusory consequences. And the missing, kind of understanding was that countries that the West encouraged to or facilitated in globalizing, like China, never bought into that understanding. Similarly, the manner in which the West invested, or particularly the United States and its coalition partners, invested in long wars, sort of led to a massive distraction about what was going on, particularly in the Asia Pacific, which of course you know very well yourself, Salvatore.
But Francis Fukuyama, in that famous essay, said that there were people who had been left behind, who were still mired in history. The challengers to the new liberal orthodoxy, I mean, the Putins of the world, the Lukashenkos of the world, the Xi Jinpings, the Islamic States, the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, aren't they just the leftovers of history?
Well, I think that's the kind of problem, isn't it? I mean, if that's the case, there's, when Fukuyama wrote that, as I said, I acknowledge the fact that Fukuyama did observe that there were, as he said, blips along the road, potentially road bumps to the end of history. But that in itself is an assumption of overweening arrogance, I would have thought, because yes, there are these, leftovers, but maybe they're not leftovers at all. Maybe they present a particular or a scenario for the future, which we haven't particularly, which the end of history perspective rather sort of dismisses. And that dismissal showed, as I would argue in the book, a lack of prudence.
Now, you suggest in Ship of Fools is Plato. By the way, was Plato an inspiration for your title?
But also a good title, actually.
Yeah, was Plato an inspiration for your title?
No, the inspiration was Hannah Arendt.
All right. Tell us about that. What is the Arendt connection to the book?
Well, Arendt was the work of Arendt that I particularly drew upon is her work on revolution, and it takes there. Arendt was a very interesting and I think not very properly appreciated political thinker, and particularly she notes the fact that actually the inspiring revolution for a political order was the American Revolution, and for a variety of reasons the American Revolution was superseded by a much, as a model, by a much worse revolution, namely the French one, and then the subsequent Russian Revolution. And for for a variety of reasons, the understanding that informed the founding fathers, Madison, Hamilton, Adams particularly, was one that was deeply influenced by Greco-Roman thought, by Plato, but particularly Aristotle and Cicero. And what the founding fathers learned, and which was so important for the American Constitution, was an ancient understanding adapted to a modern polity, which proved so successful. Yet for some reason, or for a variety of reasons, America looked in awe at European thinkers, particularly of the 19th and early 20th century, and thought they were somehow more thoughtful, more philosophical, but actually they were all, from Arendt's point of view, a waste of space, which had led to the catastrophe of Europe in the 20th century.
Right. Well, I mean, the Russian revolutionaries explicitly referenced Lenin explicitly referenced Robespierre as a model.
Exactly.
But Hamilton and Adams, though, I do want to push you a bit here, because they were, of course, Federalists in the U.S. context, and they were very much fans of the era of good feelings, the idea that, the elite of the country knew what was best for the country and could look out for it, and they were bitten by the return of politics in the form of Andrew Jackson. Mm-hmm. Isn't there kind of a straight line between the Hamiltons, the Adamses of the world, and the Tony Blairs of the world, again, and the Bill Clintons getting bitten by politics when politics comes back?
Well, I think the different, from my perspective, or the argument of the book, the importance of, or the significance of all those American, revolutionary thinkers is that their revolution was premised on a classical understanding. But in particular, as Arendt points out On Revolution, they were deeply involved with political thought, i.e. classical political thought. Particularly, they'd read their Aristotle, their Cicero, they'd studied Gibbon, they looked to a classical past. And in that, they walked backwards into modernity. They were informed, or they took on and adapted classical prudence to a modern political or an evolving modernism of the Enlightenment. This is not true of Blair or Clinton, who one suspects has, never read either Machiavelli or Aristotle, and if they have, they never understood it.
Well, I mean, let me put to you a very much a Hamiltonian, at least Hamilton the musical, Hillary Clinton, who was herself bitten by politics in the form of Donald Trump. Are there echoes here in the Clinton Trump, butting of heads, of what you're talking about the history's fools being overtaken by the return of the political.
Yeah, well, I think that's very accurate. But I want to make clear what I understand. The political is that, and political. The word politics is one that is, little understood, it seems, at the moment, but used to be a central understanding in, first year introductory to politics courses, say in the UK or Australia, which was by, a social democrat, Bernard Crick, in defense of politics. And politics assumes that there is a public space in which disagreement can occur and different policies be outlined with a space for compromise. The problem with the end of history politics of Blair and Bush and Cameron was that there was no space for an alternative worldview to the end of politics. What we've seen in terms of the return of nationalism, if you like, or some degree of nativism in Europe and America, is the return of politics, because there is still at the moment that space, but how long it remains is open to question.
Well, is it fair to say that, or to put words in your mouth, to say no politics without the polis?
Absolutely, yeah. You couldn't have phrased it better, Salvatore.
Why, thank you. You're welcome to use that in your next book. Again, I'm getting the idea from you. And the question I have for you is, do we need to have a polis, a nation, a community of some kind before we can have politics, before we can have arguments over actual policies?
Absolutely. I think, again, to take the influence of Arendt in my writing, that's precisely what she argued, that you cannot have the public debate unless you have a realm that's defined. In other words, to practice politics, you need the polis, you need the state, you need borders. You can't have free movement. You can't have a completely cosmopolitan or global citizen. Citizens are members of states, and that was something that Hamilton and Madison understood completely.
Let me ask you about a personal bête noire, and because you did bring up citizenship, I'm always a bit mystified by the attachment of members of our class, intellectuals, public servants, professionals, to the idea of multiple citizenships. How does multiple citizenship square with the idea of the nation state as a community of citizens?
Well, it doesn't really, does it? I mean, I think there is, obviously having dual citizenship myself, being both a UK citizen and an Australian one, there is, and I can live with that because I'm a member of two polises, British when I'm here, Australian when I'm there. But basically, if politics is to function, then citizenship has to be truly valued. And at the moment, the wokeness of the world is about diluting citizenship and endlessly, advancing the cause of victims everywhere. So, in a sense, citizenship has declined as a virtue and been replaced by the status of the victim or the minority, which gives you, it seems, particular value in the West in the way that citizenship doesn't. And that's, that's been part of the end of history dilemma, really.
Right. Well, I mean, I've heard the argument in Australia that you can, if you are Australian and British, you're under the same crown, and monarchists may take that position. But I mean, you can't be a dual citizen of New South Wales and Victoria. You have to choose one. You can't have both. You can't vote in both jurisdictions just because you have strong attachments to both states. Why should people have?
Yeah, but it's, you can be New South Wales when you're watching Origin, like be a Queenslander. But when push comes to shove, you're Australian, mate.
All right. Look, let me get to the more serious issue you're raising, which is the status of the citizen as an individual versus the status of groups within society. So claims of groups. What kinds of claims do groups have as groups within society?
Well, I think, well, that's a big question, isn't it? I mean, the central point about classical liberalism was it was about the individual and the social contract, and it was premised upon the modernity allowing the space for the individual to develop him or herself in a productive way within the container that is the nation state. The shift from individual rights to group rights that took off, particularly from the 1970s onwards through post-Rawlsian political thought, has sort of promoted groups at the expense of individuals. And if you can find yourself a group that's somehow marginalized or deserving of compensation, that becomes more significant to your capacity as a right-holding, right-bearing group, rather than as a right-holding individual, which is a kind of perversion. The group rights thinking perverts the idea of individual rights and individualism and takes it in a depressingly collectivist direction, which is the source of many of our contemporary woes.
Right. I mean, this group rights issue seems to be connected with another research interest of yours, which is the distinction between sin and crime. And if I can make this practical, if someone assaults another person, that's a crime. But if someone assaults that other person out of hatred for the group that person's a member of, out of homophobia, out of Islamophobia, out of racism, well, used to be that was a sin. The racism, the homophobia was a bad thing, but not a crime. Hate speech laws and hate crime laws seem to criminalize this kind of the state of mind. How does that connect with what we're talking about here, about the group rights versus individual rights?
Yeah, well, I think as I've been working on recently in a series of essays, a fascinating context of hatred is that hate has always been related to sin rather than crime. And one of the great sort of developments in the West was to separate a religious fundamentalism from the practice of the state. So instead of imposing one theological or moral order upon everyone, the distinction between crime and sin becomes more and more apparent under a classical liberal framework from the 17th and 18th century onwards. And it gets classically put together and brilliantly, really, by the Wolfenden Committee in the 1950s in the UK on homosexuality, because, you know, up until the 1950s, homosexual behavior was seen as sanctionable as a crime. And the point that Wolfenden makes is, why is that the case? It's just happens to be a preference which some people disapprove of and others find completely acceptable. To impose something that is a moral predilection of some upon the whole community is to impose a religious order upon a secular arrangement. And politics, whatever else it is, has to be secular.
All right. David Martin Jones, thank you very much for joining us. We'll have to leave it on that note. We do appreciate your making the time, especially at such a difficult time in London.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for watching. Thanks to Nico Malian, our producer, Max Hawk-Weaver, our executive producer. The director of Center for Independent Studies is Tom Switzer. Next week on Liberty, Glenn Fay will be in the chair. He'll be interviewing Bella Debrera on cancel culture. Please tune in then. You can see us next week on Liberty.